The manila envelope landed on Marcus Chen's desk with the weight of a death sentence. He stared at the official letterhead, his coffee growing cold as the words blurred before his eyes. Emergency Community Safety Tax Assessment, $15,000 due within 30 days. The signature at the bottom belonged to Howard Copeland, president of the Riverside Gardens Homeowners Association, though everyone in the neighborhood knew him by his self-appointed title, HOA Cops. Marcus ran his fingers through his graying hair, the familiar stress headache building behind his temples. His small auto repair shop had barely survived the pandemic, and now this. The morning sun filtered through the grimy windows of Chen's automotive, casting long shadows across the concrete floor where he'd spent the last 23 years building something from nothing. "Dad, you okay?" His daughter Lisa emerged from the office, her business degree from State University hanging on the wall behind her like a beacon of hope in an otherwise uncertain world. She'd come back to help him modernize the business, digitize the records, maybe even expand. Now this. "We're being taxed again," Marcus said, his voice hollow. $15,000 for community safety enhancement. "That's impossible. The city council hasn't approved any new taxes." Lisa snatched the letter from his hands, her eyes scanning the dense legal language. "This is signed by Howard Copeland. Since when does the HOA have taxation authority?" "Since never," Marcus thought. But he didn't say it aloud. Howard Copeland had been making life difficult for the small business owners along Riverside Drive ever since he'd bought that massive corner house 3 years ago. The man had somehow maneuvered himself into the HOA presidency within months of moving in. And ever since, the regulations had multiplied like bacteria in a petri dish. 2 blocks away, Amara Washington was discovering the same manila envelope, waiting for her at Blessed Hands Bakery. The sweet aroma of fresh bread and cinnamon rolls couldn't mask the bitter taste of fear as she read the assessment. $25,000. Her hands shook as she set the letter down beside the cash register where she'd been counting the morning's modest take. The bakery had been her grandmother's dream, passed down through 3 generations of women who'd learned to make something beautiful from the simplest ingredients. Amara had watched her grandmother's weathered hands shape dough into miracles, had learned that patience and love could transform flour and water into community gathering places. Now those same hands felt useless as she stared at the impossible demand. "Emergency Community Safety Tax," she read aloud to the empty bakery. "What emergency? What safety?" The bell above the door chimed, and Mrs. Rodriguez from the flower shop next door rushed in, her own manila envelope clutched in her trembling hands. At 73, Elena Rodriguez had survived the revolution in her home country, had built a new life in America with nothing but determination and an eye for beauty. She'd turned a vacant lot into a garden paradise, had brought color and life to a neighborhood that had forgotten how to bloom. "Amara, Mija, did you get one too?" Elena's accent thickened with stress, the way it always did when she was upset. $18,000 for what? "For keeping my flowers too beautiful." They stood together in the bakery's warm light, 2 women from different worlds united by the shared weight of injustice. Through the window, they could see other business owners emerging from their shops, manila envelopes in hand, faces painted with the same mixture of confusion and rage. By noon, word had spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. The emergency tax had landed on every minority-owned business along Riverside Drive: Marcus Chen's auto shop, Amara's bakery, Elena's flower shop, the Johnson family's soul food restaurant, Miguel's barber shop, and the small law office where Keisha Matthews had been practicing family law for 15 years. All of them. Not a single white-owned establishment had received the assessment. The pattern was too obvious to ignore, too calculated to be coincidental. Howard Copeland had found a way to systematically target the businesses that had given the neighborhood its character, its soul, its sense of community. The businesses that had survived redlining, survived economic downturns, survived the pandemic, now faced this manufactured crisis. That evening, they gathered at Johnson's Soul Food, the restaurant's red vinyl booths filled with worried faces and the smell of cornbread and desperation. Jerome Johnson, a mountain of a man whose gentle hands could coax magic from a kitchen, had spread the tax assessments across the table like evidence of a crime. $22,000, Jerome said, his deep voice carrying the weight of exhaustion. For what? For cooking food that brings people together, for being the place where this community comes to celebrate and mourn and just be human. Keisha Matthews, the only lawyer among them, studied the documents with professional intensity. Her law degree from Howard University had prepared her for many battles, but not for this particular brand of bureaucratic warfare. The legal language was dense, deliberately obtuse, designed to confuse and intimidate. "These assessments are completely invalid," Keisha announced, her voice cutting through the restaurant's murmur of conversation. "The HOA has no legal authority to impose taxes. This is fraud, pure and simple." "So, what do we do?" Marcus asked. "Ignore them. We fight," Amara said quietly. But her voice carried the steel of generations of women who'd refused to be broken. "We fight, because if we don't, who will? If we let him drive us out, what happens to this neighborhood? What happens to the places where people come to feel human?" The next morning brought Howard Copeland himself, arriving at Chen's Automotive in a black SUV that seemed too large for the narrow street. He emerged like a storm cloud, his expensive suit incongruous against the working-class backdrop of the neighborhood. At 55, Howard carried himself with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no, who'd spent his life believing that money and influence could reshape the world to his preferences. His pale eyes surveyed the auto shop with undisguised disdain, taking in the oil stains on the concrete, the organized chaos of tools and parts, the honest evidence of work performed by human hands. This was not his vision of Riverside Gardens. This was not the sanitized, profitable version of community he'd been quietly working toward. "Mr. Chen," Howard said, his voice carrying the artificial warmth of a politician, "I trust you've received our assessment notice." "I've received your fraud notice," Marcus replied, not looking up from the engine he was working on. "And I'm not paying it." Howard's smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered in his eyes. He'd expected resistance, had prepared for it. The neighborhood's stubborn insistence on maintaining its character had been a thorn in his side since he'd arrived. But he'd learned patience. He'd learned that the right pressure, applied at the right moment, could break anyone. "I'm afraid that's not an option," Howard said, pulling out a thick folder. "The emergency ordinance is quite clear. Failure to pay within 30 days will result in property seizure proceedings." Marcus finally looked up, his hands still greasy from the engine work, his face set in the hard lines of a man who'd spent his life working for everything he'd earned. Behind him, Lisa had emerged from the office, her presence a silent reminder of everything he had to lose. "What emergency?" Marcus asked. "What safety issue requires $15,000 from my shop?" "The increased foot traffic from your clientele has created security concerns for the residential areas," Howard replied, his pause before clientele loaded with meaning. "The HOA board has determined that additional security measures are necessary to maintain property values and community standards." The words hung in the air like poison gas, their real meaning clear to everyone in the room. Marcus felt Lisa's hand on his shoulder, a gentle restraint that kept him from saying the words that would give Howard the excuse he was looking for. "Our customers are our neighbors," Lisa said carefully. "People who live in this community, who've supported local businesses for decades. What kind of security threat do they pose? The kind that affects property values." Howard replied with a thin smile. "The kind that makes potential homebuyers look elsewhere. The kind that requires adjustment." That afternoon, similar conversations played out across the neighborhood. Howard made his rounds like a general inspecting conquered territory, delivering the same message to each business owner: pay the tax or face the consequences. The consequences, he made clear, would be swift and severe. At Blessed Hands Bakery, he lingered longer, his eyes cataloging every detail of the space that Amara's grandmother had built with love and determination. The hand-painted signs, the mismatched chairs around small tables, the display case filled with cookies shaped like flowers and hearts. None of it fit his vision of progress. "This location has tremendous potential," Howard told Amara, his voice carrying the tone of someone offering a gift. "With the right development, it could house a coffee chain, something that would really serve the community's needs." "It already serves the community's needs," Amara replied, her voice steady, despite the anger burning in her chest. "It served them for 43 years. Times change," Howard said with a shrug. "Communities evolve. Those who adapt survive. Those who don't." He left the sentence hanging, but his meaning was clear. The neighborhood was changing, and he was the agent of that change. The small businesses that had given Riverside Gardens its character were relics, obstacles to the kind of development that would bring in the right kind of people, the kind of people who could afford to live in his vision of the future. That evening, the business owners gathered again at Johnson's Soul Food. But this time, the atmosphere was different. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a grim determination. They'd spent the day comparing notes, sharing stories of Howard's visits, piecing together the full scope of his plan. "He's not just trying to collect taxes," Keisha said, her lawyer's mind working through the implications. "He's trying to force us out entirely. The amounts are calculated to be impossible to pay." "But why?" Elena asked, her voice small and confused. "Why us? Why now?" "Because we're inconvenient," Jerome said bluntly. "Because we represent something he can't control or profit from. Because we're in the way of his vision for this neighborhood." Marcus had been quiet throughout the meeting, his mind working through possibilities, calculating odds, assessing risks. He'd spent 23 years building his business, had weathered economic storms and personal tragedies, had raised his daughter in the apartment above the shop. This was more than a business to him. This was home. "I'm not paying," Marcus said finally. "Whatever he does, whatever consequences he threatens, I'm not paying. This is extortion, and I won't be part of it." One by one, the others voiced their agreement. They would stand together, would face whatever Howard Copeland could throw at them. They would not be driven from their homes, their businesses, their community. They would fight. The 30-day deadline came and went like a storm cloud passing over the neighborhood. Howard had expected capitulation, had prepared for the satisfaction of watching his plan unfold with mathematical precision. Instead, he faced unified resistance, a wall of determination that his usual tactics couldn't penetrate. The first property seizure notice arrived at Chen's Automotive on a Tuesday morning in October. Marcus found it taped to his door, the official seal of the county sheriff's office giving it an authority that made his stomach clench. He had 72 hours to vacate the premises or face forcible removal. By noon, similar notices had appeared at every business along Riverside Drive. The newspaper ran a small article buried on page 6. A brief mention of property disputes in the Riverside Gardens neighborhood. The local news didn't cover it at all. It was as if Howard had orchestrated not just the seizures, but the silence that would accompany them. That evening, Lisa Chen made a phone call that would change everything. She dialed a number she'd memorized years ago but rarely used. A number that connected her to her Uncle David, her mother's brother, who'd chosen a different path than the rest of the family. "Uncle David, it's Lisa. I need your help." David Chen had left the neighborhood 20 years ago to join the FBI, had worked his way up through the ranks to become a senior agent in the Bureau's white-collar crime division. He'd always maintained that his work was about justice, about protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. Now his family was among those people. "What's going on, Lisa?" "There's a man named Howard Copeland who's trying to steal our neighborhood. He's using fake tax assessments to seize property from minority-owned businesses. Dad's about to lose everything." David listened as Lisa explained the situation, his trained mind cataloging the details, identifying the patterns that suggested federal crimes: mail fraud, racketeering, civil rights violations. If the pattern was as clear as Lisa described, Howard Copeland had made a critical error in his calculations. "Send me everything," David said. "Every document, every communication, every piece of evidence you have, and tell your father to hang on. Help is coming." The FBI investigation began quietly, invisibly, like a digital ghost moving through Howard Copeland's carefully constructed world. David Chen and his team traced financial records, analyzed communication patterns, interviewed potential witnesses. What they found was a conspiracy that reached deeper than anyone had imagined. Howard Copeland wasn't just a racist neighbor with delusions of grandeur. He was the front man for a development company that had been systematically targeting minority-owned businesses across 3 counties. The fake tax assessments were just the latest tool in a toolkit that included predatory lending, zoning violations, and selective code enforcement. The pattern was always the same. Target minority-owned businesses in neighborhoods ripe for development. Create financial pressure through manufactured crises. Force the owners to sell at below-market prices. Demolish the existing structures and build expensive condos or chain businesses. Profit from the destruction of communities. Meanwhile, in Riverside Gardens, the business owners were facing their darkest hour. The property seizure notices had been followed by court orders, and the court orders had been followed by sheriff's deputies with clipboard and blank stares. The legal system that was supposed to protect them had become the instrument of their destruction. Marcus stood in his shop, surrounded by the tools and memories of 23 years, and felt the weight of defeat settling on his shoulders. The deputies would return tomorrow morning. He had until then to pack up his life and find somewhere else to go. Lisa had spent the day calling lawyers, but none of them could work miracles. "Dad, Uncle David says to wait. He says help is coming. Your uncle is a good man, but he's not a magician. The law is the law, and according to the law, we have to go." Across the street, Amara was boxing up her grandmother's recipes, the handwritten cards that contained 43 years of love and tradition. Elena was carefully wrapping the ceramic vases that had held 1,000 flower arrangements, each one a small piece of beauty in a world that often forgot the importance of beautiful things. Howard Copeland walked through the neighborhood that evening like a conquering general surveying his victory. The lights were on in every business, families and friends helping the owners pack up their lives. By tomorrow night, it would all be gone. The auto shop would become a coffee franchise. The bakery would become a chain restaurant. The flower shop would become a cell phone store. Progress, he told himself. Evolution, the natural order of things. Communities that couldn't adapt deserved to disappear. and he was simply the agent of that inevitable change. The fact that he would profit handsomely from the transformation was just the market's way of rewarding efficiency. The next morning dawned gray and cold. October's bite sharp in the air. The sheriff's deputies were scheduled to arrive at 9 o'clock, and by 8:30, a small crowd had gathered on Riverside Drive. Neighbors who'd shopped at these businesses for decades. Children who'd grown up buying candy from Elena's flower shop. Customers who'd become friends over the years. They stood in silent solidarity, bearing witness to the end of an era. Some held signs, hastily made but heartfelt: "Save our neighborhood," "Justice for small business," "Don't let them win." Others simply stood, their presence a form of protest against the forces that were reshaping their world. At exactly 9 o'clock, the convoy arrived. But it wasn't the sheriff's deputies. It was a fleet of black SUVs with federal plates, FBI agents in windbreakers, and serious expressions. They moved with the precision of a military operation, surrounding Howard Copeland's house, securing the HOA offices, establishing a perimeter around the entire neighborhood. David Chen emerged from the lead vehicle, his badge visible on his chest, his face set in the hard lines of professional determination. He'd spent 20 years working cases, but this one was personal. This one was about family, about community, about the difference between justice and the law. "Howard Copeland, you're under arrest for mail fraud, racketeering, conspiracy, and civil rights violations." The words carried across the street like a thunderclap, and the crowd that had gathered to witness the end of their neighborhood instead watched the beginning of their salvation. Howard Copeland, the man who'd styled himself as their savior, was led away in handcuffs, his expensive suit rumpled, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. The FBI search of Howard's house revealed a treasure trove of evidence. Financial records showing payments from the development company. Communication logs detailing the systematic targeting of minority-owned businesses. Maps marked with future development sites. Email chains discussing the most effective ways to pressure business owners into selling. The HOA office yielded even more damning evidence. The fake tax assessments were just the tip of the iceberg. Howard had been embezzling from the HOA's legitimate funds, using the association's legal authority to harass business owners, creating a paper trail of fraudulent documents designed to give his scheme the appearance of legitimacy. But the most shocking discovery came from Howard's personal computer. A detailed plan for the redevelopment of Riverside Gardens, complete with architectural drawings, financial projections, and a timeline that stretched over 5 years. The current wave of seizures was just phase 1 of a much larger plan. The plan revealed the scope of Howard's ambition. He hadn't just been targeting individual businesses. He'd been systematically working to transform the entire neighborhood, to erase its character, and replace it with something that would generate higher property values and attract wealthier residents. Phase 2 would have involved pressuring long-time residents to sell their homes. Phase 3 would have brought in the demolition crews. Phase 4 would have seen the construction of luxury condos and chain businesses. Phase 5 would have been the grand opening of the new, improved Riverside Gardens, a neighborhood scrubbed clean of its history, its character, its soul. The arrest made national news. The story had everything that modern media loved: corruption, racism, FBI raids, and a community fighting back against injustice. Camera crews descended on Riverside Gardens, interviewing business owners, neighbors, and anyone who'd been affected by Howard's scheme. Marcus found himself standing in front of Chen's automotive, facing a reporter's camera and trying to put into words what the last month had meant to him and his family. Behind him, the tools of his trade gleamed in the afternoon sun, and the smell of motor oil and honest work filled the air. "This isn't just about my business," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the weight of emotion behind it. This is about the kind of community we want to be. This is about whether we're going to let fear and greed destroy the places where people come together, where families build their lives, where neighbors become friends. Amara spoke from behind the counter of Blessed Hands Bakery. Her grandmother's recipes spread before her, like a testament to endurance and love. The camera caught the warm light filtering through the windows, the handwritten signs that had welcomed customers for nearly half a century, the evidence of a life built on service and community. My grandmother always said that bread is more than just food, Amara said, her hands busy with dough as she spoke. It's a promise. It's a commitment to nourish people, to bring them together, to create something good from simple ingredients. That's what this neighborhood has always been about. That's what we're fighting to preserve. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive. Howard Copeland's attorney tried to frame the case as a civil dispute, a disagreement over property rights and development plans. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the federal prosecutors were thorough in their presentation. The fake tax assessments were voided immediately, and all the seized properties were returned to their owners. The HOA's legitimate funds, which Howard had been embezzling from, were restored through the seizure of his personal assets. The development company that had been funding his operations was subjected to a federal investigation that would eventually lead to multiple indictments. But the most satisfying moment came during the sentencing hearing, when each of the business owners had the opportunity to address the court and explain how Howard's scheme had affected their lives and their community. They spoke not just of financial hardship, but of the deeper damage that had been done to their sense of security and belonging. Elena Rodriguez, her voice strong despite her 73 years, spoke of the flower shop that had been her life's work, of the beauty she'd brought to the neighborhood, of the relationships she'd built over decades of service. She spoke of the fear that had kept her awake at night, the worry that everything she'd built would be lost to a man who saw only profit where she saw love. Flowers are fragile things, Elena said, her hands folded in her lap as she addressed the judge. They need care. They need attention. They need someone who understands their value. Communities are like flowers in that way. They need people who understand that beauty and profit are not the same thing, that some things are worth more than money. Jerome Johnson spoke of the restaurant that had been his family's gathering place, of the meals that had celebrated births and mourned deaths, of the conversations that had changed lives over plates of cornbread and collard greens. He spoke of the responsibility he felt to maintain a space where people could come together, where differences could be set aside in favor of shared humanity. Food is love made visible, Jerome said, his deep voice carrying the weight of conviction. When you sit down at someone's table, when you share a meal, you're saying that you trust them to nourish you, to welcome you, to treat you as family. That's what we've been doing for 26 years. That's what this man tried to take away from us. The judge, a woman in her 60s who'd grown up in a neighborhood not unlike Riverside Gardens, listened to each testimony with careful attention. When it came time for sentencing, her words carried the weight of moral authority as well as legal judgment. Mr. Copeland, you have been convicted of systematically targeting minority-owned businesses with fraudulent tax assessments, embezzling funds from the Homeowners Association, and conspiring to deprive citizens of their civil rights. But your crimes go deeper than the technical violations of federal law. You have attacked the very foundation of community, the bonds that hold neighbors together, the trust that allows societies to function. Howard Copeland was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, with restitution to be paid to all the affected businesses. The development company that had funded his operations was fined millions of dollars and barred from operating in the county. The HOA bylaws were rewritten to prevent future abuse of power, but the most significant change was in the neighborhood itself. The crisis had brought the community together in ways that decades of peaceful coexistence had never achieved. Business owners who'd been friendly neighbors became close friends. Customers who'd been regulars became family. The threat of losing everything had shown them how much they actually had. 6 months after Howard's arrest, Riverside Gardens hosted its first annual Community Day, a celebration that brought together everyone who'd been affected by the crisis. The street was closed to traffic, and each business opened its doors to showcase what made the neighborhood special. Children ran between the auto shop, where Marcus had set up a display of vintage car parts, and the bakery, where Amara was teaching cookie decorating classes. Elena's flower shop became a garden workshop, where she showed neighbors how to create beauty from seeds and soil. Jerome's restaurant offered samples of his famous cornbread, and the sound of laughter and conversation filled the air. Lisa Chen, who'd stayed in the neighborhood to help her father modernize the auto shop, found herself coordinating the event with a natural ease that surprised her. She'd discovered that her business degree was just as valuable in building community as it was in building profit. That success could be measured in more than just dollars and cents. David Chen arrived for the celebration wearing civilian clothes instead of his FBI windbreaker, his federal badge replaced by a smile that hadn't appeared on his face in years. He'd taken vacation time to attend, to see the neighborhood that his niece had helped save, to understand why this place had been worth fighting for. "You did this," he told Lisa, as they watched children playing in the street, their laughter mixing with the sound of music from Jerome's restaurant. "You made the call that saved all of this." "We all did this," Lisa replied, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who'd learned that individual success meant nothing without community to share it with. "We all chose to fight instead of giving up. We all chose to stand together instead of falling apart." As the sun set on the first Community Day, the business owners gathered once more at Johnson's Soul Food. But this time, the atmosphere was different. Instead of fear and desperation, there was hope and determination. Instead of uncertainty about the future, there was confidence in their ability to face whatever challenges might come. Marcus raised his glass of sweet tea, his voice carrying the weight of gratitude and the promise of perseverance. Around him, the faces of friends and neighbors reflected the warm light of Jerome's restaurant, the place where they'd first decided to fight, the place where they'd learned that community was stronger than individual ambition. "To the neighborhood that wouldn't die," Marcus said, his words carrying across the restaurant like a benediction. "To the people who wouldn't give up, to the future we're going to build together." The glasses clinked together, the sound mixing with laughter and conversation, with the promise of tomorrow and the satisfaction of today. Outside, the lights of Riverside Gardens twinkled like stars, each one representing a business, a family, a dream that had survived the storm and emerged stronger. In the months that followed, the neighborhood began to thrive in ways that Howard Copeland's development plan never could have achieved. The businesses that had been targeted became gathering places for the entire community. The crisis had shown everyone what they had to lose, and that knowledge made them more determined to protect and nurture what they'd built. New businesses opened, drawn by the sense of community and mutual support. A young couple opened a bookstore in the space that had once been earmarked for a chain coffee shop. A group of teenagers, inspired by the community's resilience, started a non-profit organization focused on supporting minority-owned businesses. The story of Riverside Gardens became a case study in business schools, an example of how communities could resist gentrification and preserve their character. Journalists wrote articles about the power of grassroots organizing. Activists cited the neighborhood as proof that ordinary people could fight back against corporate power and win. But for the people who lived and worked in Riverside Gardens, the victory was more personal and more profound. They'd learned that community wasn't just about shared geography or mutual convenience. It was about shared values, shared struggles, shared commitment to something larger than individual success. Amara would often think about her grandmother's hands, the way they'd shaped dough into something beautiful and nourishing. She'd learned that communities were like bread, requiring patience and care, requiring the right ingredients mixed in the right proportions. Fear and greed were like too much salt, overwhelming the other flavors, ruining the final product. Elena tended her flowers with renewed purpose, understanding that beauty was not just decoration, but resistance, not just aesthetics, but politics. Every bloom was a statement that the world needed more than profit, more than efficiency, more than the cold calculations of development plans. Marcus worked on cars with the satisfaction of someone who'd learned that fixing things was about more than replacing broken parts. Sometimes the damage went deeper, required more care, demanded an understanding of how all the pieces fit together. Communities were like engines in that way, complex systems that required skilled hands and patient hearts. The evening news moved on to other stories, and the camera crews packed up their equipment and left. But the people of Riverside Gardens remained, continued their work, continued their lives, continued their commitment to each other and to the place they'd chosen to call home. Years later, when children who'd grown up in the neighborhood moved away to college or careers, they would return to find the auto shop still fixing cars, the bakery still making bread, the flower shop still bringing beauty to the world. They would find that some things were worth fighting for, that some victories were worth celebrating, that some communities were worth preserving. The manila envelope that had started it all was framed now, hanging on the wall of Chen's Automotive, as a reminder of what they'd survived and what they'd learned. Sometimes, customers would ask about it, and Marcus would tell them the story of how a neighborhood had refused to die, had chosen to fight, had discovered that the strongest foundations were built not on profit, but on love. The emergency tax that was supposed to drive them out had instead brought them together. The crisis that was meant to destroy their community had instead strengthened it. The man who'd tried to erase their neighborhood had instead helped them understand what made it worth preserving. In the end, Howard Copeland's plan had failed, not because of legal technicalities or FBI investigations, but because he'd fundamentally misunderstood what he was fighting against. He'd seen only individual businesses, isolated targets that could be picked off one by one. He'd never comprehended the network of relationships, the web of mutual support, the deep roots that connected every person and every business to the larger community. The neighborhood that emerged from the crisis was stronger than the one that had entered it, more aware of its own value, more committed to its own preservation. The businesses that had been targeted became symbols of resistance, gathering places for people who understood that progress and profit were not the same thing, that some things were worth more than money. As the sun set on another day in Riverside Gardens, the lights came on in windows and storefronts, each one a small beacon of hope in a world that often seemed determined to extinguish such lights. The neighborhood had survived its emergency, had passed its test, had proven that communities built on love and mutual support could withstand any storm. The emergency tax had been paid, but not in dollars. It had been paid in courage, in solidarity, in the determination to stand together when standing apart would have been easier. It had been paid in the knowledge that some things were worth fighting for, that some victories were worth celebrating, that some communities were worth preserving for future generations who would need places to call home. The story of Riverside Gardens would be told for years to come, passed down from parents to children, shared among friends and neighbors, carried to other communities facing similar challenges. It would serve as proof that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they chose to stand together, when they chose to fight for what they believed in, when they chose love over fear. And in the end, that was the most important lesson of all, that communities were not built by developers or destroyed by taxes, but created and sustained by the daily choices of ordinary people who chose to care for each other, to support each other, to build something beautiful together in a world that often seemed determined to tear such things apart. The emergency was over, but the community remained. The tax had been defeated, but the bonds that had formed in fighting it would last forever. The neighborhood had been saved, but more importantly, it had learned how to save itself, how to recognize threats before they became crises, how to stand together when standing apart would have been easier. In Riverside Gardens, the lights stayed on, the doors remained open, and the work of building community continued. One day at a time, one relationship at a time, one act of love and resistance at a time. The emergency tax had been paid in full, and the receipt was written in the faces of children playing in the street, in the sound of laughter from the restaurant, in the smell of fresh bread, and the sight of flowers blooming in defiance of every force that sought to uproot them. The neighborhood had won, but more than that, it had learned how to keep winning, how to keep fighting, how to keep building something beautiful in a world that needed more beauty, more community, more places where people could come together and remember what it meant to be human.